All right, it is noon, so I guess we should get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here. This is Kiss and Tell, Anne Lister and Sex. And the sort of summary of this is, we know you're not supposed to kiss and tell, but Anne Lister wrote it down. So now we're asking Anne Choma and Dr. Anna Clark to explain it. My name is Ty Ginter. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm a lesbian and queer historian. I'm the founder of DC Diaries, which is an oral history memory mapping project out of Washington, DC, and I am very excited to be your facilitator today. So in this session, Anne Choma and Anna Clark will give us the lowdown on sex in Miss Lister's life, from groveling and incurring a cross to the significance of a bedpost we use as a sex toy, among many other things. We metaphorically join Anne in the blue room to discover what really went down under those coarse woolen sheets. So I would be very grateful to introduce the panelists. So as Anne Choma is a transcriber of Anne Lister's journals and the lead consultant to Sally Wainwright on Gentleman Jack, the BBC and HBO television drama based on Anne Lister's life. She's also the author of the series companion book, Gentleman Jack, The Real Anne Lister. Anna Clark is the author of Anne Lister and the Construction of Lesbian Identity in the Journal of History and Sexuality, a new chapter on Anne Lister in Alternative Histories of the Self, 2018, and Desire, a History of Sexuality in Europe, 2019, second edition. She teaches at the University of Minnesota. And so how this is going to work is that I'm going to be asking Anne and Anna a couple questions, and they are going to have a discussion about these questions and about what we find in the diaries and what we find about lesbian history. And then from there, we will open probably the last 10 minutes of the panel up to questions from the audience. And we look forward to seeing what questions you have. So is everyone ready to begin?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, it's a pleasure to have both of you here. It's very exciting to have you here. So we're going to start off a little bit broad, just so for some folks who might not have a background and a history of sort of the context that we're setting ourselves in. So I guess my first question for both of you is, what did lesbianism and having romances and sexual relationships with women, what did that mean for Anne Lister? And what is the historical context she found herself in having these relationships and these sexual encounters in?
Well, it's really interesting that in the time period she lived in early 19th century Britain, not in France, which is important because she learns a lot when she goes to France, but there really wasn't in her Yorkshire society an idea of lesbianism. There certainly wasn't the word at all, and there may have been an elite circle, people who went to France, some notion, but she really had to kind of figure it out herself. But also when the diaries came out, the transcripts that Helen and Whitbread did in 1988, when they came out, there were historians at the time who also thought that women couldn't even have sex because if they didn't have any concept of having sex, then they might have been very romantic with each other, which they certainly were, but they said, but they couldn't imagine having sex. And then the diaries come and this kind of blew the whole thing out of the water because it proved they certainly did. And some people even thought that they were forgeries because it kind of went against their whole theories at the time. But obviously she did, and she wrote about it.
Yeah, I think, for Anne, I mean, the context at the time was that women could only love women within the context of romantic friendship. And Anne, she referred to that as a warm friendship. And in fact, she used that term to defend herself, in the eventuality of her being discovered with M, or their connection being discovered. And she always said that warm friendship could explain away anything that they did together. So that was the context that they were living in at the time. And of course, as Anne has just said, women were looked upon as being passionless, without passion. And of course, we know that at any point in time in history, that politics, religion, and prejudice plays a part in how sex and sexuality is presented.
And she did try to figure out what it was to love only, as she said, I love only women and they love me in return. But she didn't have an idea of herself as a lesbian in the same way that we do today. And although she certainly had a lot of lovers and some of them knew each other, and she thought some of them had more predilections for only desiring women, she saw herself as different from other people. And like Anne said, she would use the idea of warm friendship to conceal what she was really doing. So she saw herself as really unique rather than part of a whole culture or whole community. In fact, when she met women like Miss Pickford, who was very masculine and who had relationships with women, she lied to her about what she was actually engaged in.
I think
Can you explain what? I'm
sorry. It's really interesting what Anna just said, is because Anne Lister had no script to follow. She had no groups to go to, no language to inform who she was. So she had to make up language for, to describe her own sexuality. So I think it's very interesting that, she described herself as an oddity. She said she was formed like nobody else. And it's really interesting. I've always found it very interesting that when she met somebody like Miss Pickford, who was a butch woman, that she still wanted to distinguish herself from somebody like Miss Pickford. Maybe that's something we can talk about later on.
And could you explain what that means for folks who might not be familiar, what romantic friendship means? Could you explain what that term means?
I think the best way to describe it is to actually go back to the diary and to, Anne and Anne met, two of the most famous women who were living as under this banner of romantic friendship, and that was the ladies of Llangollen. And basically, these were women who lived together quite happily, but they lived together purely as society saw them as friends. And nobody cast any doubt about the way they were living together or what kind of a union they had. It was always kind of sometimes seen as idyllic, harmless, romantic. But the key underlying thing was that it was passionless, it was without sex. And of course, we know that when Anne goes to see the ladies of Llangollen as a younger woman, that when she meets at least one of them, she's intrigued by this romantic idyll of them living in the country in Wales, but she casts doubt on the nature of their friendship. She sees something very different, and so does Mariana when we talk to Mariana Lawton about it. I think it's something that's really explored in great detail, and it's in Emma Donohue's book, Passions Between Women. So I would recommend, anybody listening and watching today is to get hold of that book, because what Emma talks about in that book is how we can reinterpret these friendships and how we can see them, specifically a lesbian rereading of these friendships. We can kind of reclaim them as being something very different. But I think, going back to what I said early on, for Anne, she used it as a kind of armor. She used it as the term romantic friendship, warm friendship, as something she could hide behind.
Thank you. So where do we see sex in Anne Lister's diaries? That might be a broad question, but how does she use, I guess in more bringing it down, how does she use her diaries to record her sexual encounters and her sexual experimentation? And where do we see that play out in like certain locations or at certain time periods of her life?
Well, she, as a lot of you are doing the transcripts, and first of all, I should say that I'm so grateful for all the people who are doing transcripts, and it's hard to keep up with all the amazing things that have been discovered, and it probably is going to change how we see Anne Lister. I've certainly learned new things and have new theories because of that. But the code, of course, is the key, because she only wrote about what she did sexually in code, and Steph Galloway has a really good guide to the abbreviations and examples of her sexual language. Which you probably know that the cross, or the cross, was the masturbation, kiss. She also had a little symbol over it, which Steph illustrates, of the kiss, which seems to be making love or orgasm, because she says, I gave her a good kiss, she gave me one. And she the first thing I think that Patricia Hughes found is in 1817 with Eliza Rain. She talks about Felix, seems to be, or means happiness in Latin, her first sexual mention. And then she goes on, she invents words like grubbling, which means kind of grubbing, or for her it means going up under the petticoats and touching women. It's such a funny word. And queer, which is, quim was a contemporary word about for the vagina or female genitals, but she says queer instead of quim. So she has all these words she uses, and she's very explicit about what she does, you know, how far she gets up with her middle finger. So, you know, she's definitely having sex. Anne, do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I just think it's interesting to say something about, you know, the span of Anne's life and how the way she talks about sex at the beginning of the diaries as to how, in terms of how she does it at the end of the diaries. And of course, that always depends on who she's with at the time. And I think, you know, throughout all of this discussion, I think it's really important to hang on to that this is a span of Anne Lister's life. And so as a much younger woman, she seems to be having an awful lot of sex. She writes about it a lot. She writes about it in code. And she, as you say, Anna, she's extremely explicit, but she gives us some nuggets and gems of information about sex that, you know, would have been lost, we would have never heard of. And one of them, and I think Steph is the one that exposed this, is that, you know, about using rose oil on Tib to make her more moist. So she found her own form of lubrication for women, and unusual words like dinky, you know, for vaginal lubrication. And so I think it's, you know, she offers up these really, really fascinating, interesting ways of describing how women had sex in those days. And also some of the language she uses. I mean, we know that Anne Lister was very, she loved exploring her own body. I mean, I think I said on another Zoom call once about that. I think, you know, Anne Lister, she wrote the original body roadmap, the A to Z body roadmap for sex, because she knew how to explore her body. She knew where to stop, which bits to move on from, which gave her the most pleasure. And of course, she could, learning from her own body and the pleasures it gave her, she could give to other women.
And then one really, oh, go on, Anne.
No, it's okay.
Okay, one really interesting thing that I'm just figuring out, and I think the transcribers and stuff can really help with this, because when she discovered the clitoris, and I am beginning to think that in the 1820s, she seems to really focus on penetration. And this may have occurred earlier, but I'm not sure. But she's, you know, putting her finger up herself and other women. And she's exploring, as Anne says. And I am beginning to think that she was reading, especially when she was in France, but in England too, she was reading contemporary sex manuals and also anatomical manuals. And there was this old idea that the vagina was like a penis turned inside out. And some of these sex manuals mention the clitoris and some of them don't. But as she's putting her finger up herself, she says, I think I found the clitoris, but it's like up the vagina. And then she says, but I wish it would come down further so I could give pleasure to other women. And then I think with Mrs. Barlow, she's worried that it might have come down and blocked the vagina. So I think she might be actually thinking the cervix is the clitoris, because the contemporary anatomy was so unclear. But this is something that we'll really have to explore further in the diaries. And then it's because it's not until 1831 that she definitively figured out what the clitoris was in Cross, figuring out if I had one, which obviously she does. So, but she's obviously touching it. I think when she talks about touching the top of the queer, she finds that's a better way. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, it's interesting that, you know, Anna, that it happens in 1831. And I've got the quote here, and she says, "Till 3.5 incurred a cross thinking of them. It was from studying female organs of generation and finding out distinctly for the first time in my life the clitoris." And she says that at the time that she's reading Diaries, History of Anatomy. And she pinpoints the pages of page 290 to page 335. And then she continues to sit in the wash closet examining her clitoris. So I kind of think it's very interesting that it's, as you say, Anna, it's like, you know, the contemporary notions and an understanding of what the clitoris was. But she wants to find out for herself. And so again, she goes back to her own body and she wants to find it on her. But we know, of course, that she kind of knew what the clitoris was because she was able to give her women pleasure. And but I think she wraps it all up in anatomical medical knowledge, and that just speaks around Lister's scientific way of wanting to understand things. And then again, I mean, she continues throughout that period of actually locking herself away and exploring and trying to get to understand the clitoris a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot more to be done about exactly what she read. There's also an anatomist, Dupuytren, who she talks about, and who was an anatomist at the time. I just Googled him really quickly, who treats Maria Barlow. So, you know, as you all find things, it'll be really interesting to see exactly what she's reading and exactly what she finds, and how there's differences between France, because the French were much more open, and the French did have an idea of what they called sapphism or tribads. They were much more open about sexuality. So she learns a lot when she goes to France, of course, as well as, or she confirms what she already knows by her own experimentation.
Yeah, and I think you know, when we're talking about specific part of the anatomy, as in the clitoris, I mean, we know that Anne Lister incurs a lot of crosses. She masturbates a lot, but it's also extremely interesting in terms of how she described those kind of the masturbatory experiences. And she uses the word erection and relieving herself. It's so much like, you know, how you'd expect a man to describe the way he would feel having relieved himself. And I think that's incredibly interesting. But going back to what you said, Anna, about France and how, you know, greater understanding and towards anatomy, and the fact that Anne could go there and study anatomy is very interesting. And of course, we know from the length of time she was there, from 1826 to 1831, that she hired a studio so that she could study the body in greater detail.
Yes, and she really did dissect a baby, and she was that wasn't exaggerated and gentleman. Jack, yes, and it's also that she read a lot of classics and notes on the classics, and I was just going back to my very old notes of the extracts from her readings, which are in the Anne Lister archives. And if anyone knows Latin, it would be really great, because there's actually like a Latin sexual vocabulary that refers to tribads and cunnilingus and fellatio. So she learns a lot from those, but they're still pretty vague on women having sex with women, but they do get it. The ancient Romans were extremely explicit about actual sex, like sexual acts, and had a very elaborate vocabulary about sexual acts. And she learns a lot from that. So that's something that can be examined or more. It's something I've written about a little bit. But and the French also use the term sapphic, but she seems to at one point she repudiates the idea of sapphism. Of course, she's, because she lies all the time, so she may be lying about what she thinks about herself. But she she depicts sapphism as more like using a dildo or something artificial, and she's always talking about her own actions as natural.
Yeah, she saw sapphism as being artificial, and she felt like, you know, to be true to her oddity and her lesbianism, then she should only love women, and that again is going back to this idea of nature and this innate idea that she was made very different to other people. I just want to pick up on Anna on something you were talking about just now about the ancient texts and how she would go to those texts for information, but that she would also use them as titillation and as foreplay. I mean, you know, we know that she read Marshall's epigrams, and that immediately on reading them, that her and Mariana would jump into bed and have sex. And you know, that, so it's very interesting that that's what they had to go to find. It was their version of porn. But then, of course, you know, that we know that she read across the ancient classics for all sorts of different things, but it's certainly a huge part of the development of her understanding of the body and sexuality by going back to those classical works.
Oh yes, and one of those Marshall's epigrams, one of these ancient Roman poets, has a very explicit depiction of a woman called Philaenis, who it's so funny because it's supposed to be extremely negative, but to us it isn't. It's about this strong woman who works out in the gym, and she does have sex with boys, but also she licks or sucks girls' quims, and then she gets totally drunk, and she's, you know, lifting weights in the gym. So, and this is supposed to be terribly, terribly insulting, but that's something, you know, an image of what we would call lesbian that we could read today. But I wanted to ask Anne something about which uses the term erection. I've seen it in the 1830s. I wonder when she starts using that term, because I wonder if she becomes a little more masculine.
I think I mean, I've seen it used in the early diaries, but I think it's when, interestingly for me, it seems to be used more when she's seeing masturbation or incurring cross as being shameful, and that appears more in the earlier diaries, where it's almost like a vile habit that she wants to get rid of. And she tends to always talk about having this when she's lying in bed in the morning and she's thinking of somebody, thinking of Mariana, and she incurs a cross. And then I noticed that she would use those words, erection and relieving herself. It was just like something that she needed to do to relieve this enormous passion that she had within her body. So I think it features less in the later diaries, for me anyway, my reading diaries. It was just this sheer passionate, violent longing to be with somebody, and it was purely a physical release for her. And she described, you know, I think, you know, the erection, and I suppose, you know, the clitoris becomes erect when you're sexually aroused, and she uses that term, but it's very masculinist. Yeah, I mean, the other thing I just want to say as well, because I mentioned it on Twitter, and this is thanks to Marlene Oliveira, who's done some amazing transcription, is that she exposed, and it's probably one of my favourite sexual anecdotes, actually. And again, it goes back to her reading one of the ancient texts. And Anne, on the 24th of July, 1824, she's reading Johannes Secundus. I'm not sure which work it is. It might be the Book of Kisses. I'm not sure which one it is. But after she's read that book, she could not resist incurring a cross. And she writes, "Finished the thing, and I sat astride one of the bedposts and incurred a cross." So Anne was, you know, she was the mistress of practicality. And of course, sex toys didn't exist in those days. So what did she use? She used a bedpost. And that's one. I came across there's another actual quote where she sits astride the bedpost as well, to relieve herself. And so it's just one of those gems that appear from the diaries, making use of Shipman's furniture to relieve herself.
She does talk about dildos, but she claims she disapproves of them, and she never mentions using one.
No, she definitely, I've never come across her mentioning using one at all.
Yeah, so we did, but you never know. And yeah, it's so interesting about her reading. Oh, the other thing I wanted to mention with occurring across is that masturbation at this time was seen as really terrible, not only religiously, but medically. And there was, in fact, just a hysteria running from the 18th to the 19th century, and including the French were also very worried about masturbation. For the French, it's like, well, you should really be having sex with someone else, not masturbation. For the British, it's more like sex is bad. But a lot of punishment of masturbation. There were pamphlets about it, worries about children doing it. So it's really interesting. It's fairly unusual for someone to write so much about it. But she was very religious, but in a quite unorthodox way. I just found something about how she talked with Marianne about how she didn't believe in the religious dogma. So she was able to reconcile herself to what she believed. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, you know, that kind of rhetoric of being ashamed of what she's doing, it peters out, and really, you know, as she matures as a woman, as she matures as a sexual woman, those kind of comments appear very well. I've never seen them in the later diaries, and I think, you know, going back to the religious side of Anne Lister, it's interesting in a way that she did have that kind of shame in the early days, because really from the word go, and we know from Helen Whitbread's book that and all the extracts in there, that Anne was reconciled to her sexuality, and she could stand in the face of God and she could speak to him, and she knew that she was at one with God. Her sexuality and her were at one with God. So it's interesting in those early days that she did feel that. But I also think it was also about, you know, she felt like it was she could be doing something more useful. And Lister was always thinking about doing something practical and more useful. And I think lying in bed, masturbating on a morning was seen as something that it was just something practical that had to be done. But she felt like it was kind of probably shameful in the sense that it was taking up the time, and she didn't have a woman with her who she could love and be loved by.
Could either of you speak on the Langton House Party and how that is shown in the diaries and how that sort of encapsulates all of what you're talking about?
And why don't you talk about that?
Yeah, the famous Langton House Party at Langton Hall in North Yorkshire, the home of Tib Norcliffe, of the Norcliffe family, Isabella Norcliffe, one of Anne's lovers, and the 1820 house party, and with Tib, Miss Vallance, and Anne Lister, and it was like they were there for a period of time, and it became a love fest really, and we get to know so much from that period of what that tells us so much about women's sex and sexuality, and I know that some comments have been made from those extracts about consent and about how Anne behaved with some of the women, and basically Anne and Tib Norcliffe, they seduced Miss Vallance. Miss Vallance was not without experience, and but certainly it's very, very interesting. It was very explicit, and it was almost like, you know, a few days of just bed hopping, and you know, the power dynamics within that those few days is extremely interesting, and so basically, you know, seduces Miss Vallance, and then Tib also gets into bed with Miss Vallance. So it's not an orgy, but it's extremely explicit, and some of the comments that have been made from that, as I said, is about consent and taking advantage of Miss Vallance, Miss Vallance resisting, and And then at one point she apologises, Miss Valence, for taking advantage of her when Miss Valence is on the settee or the sofa and Miss Valence can't move. But then Anne says that to come back at that, she does apologise, but then she says something like, but Miss Valence had an opportunity to stop me, or she could have gesticulated and said, you know, I don't want you to do this. You know, and again, it's I resist painting Anne Lister as a sexual libertine. I don't want to be seen as that. She's certainly not a Marquis de Sade, and she's not, you know, she's not the Earl of Rochester. She is not that kind of debauched person with no moral principles at all. And I think when we talk about consent, we have to think about, you know, the idea of the times that she was operating. I mean, Annie, you might want to come in here and talk about it. But again, I mean, the Langton House party is very interesting for lots of different reasons. Basically, lots of sex went on there. Miss Valence succumbed to Anne's seduction techniques. You know, Anne talked about Miss Valence being very wet, making no resistance at times, and being complicit. So there's lots of sort of jarring things going on there. You've got this idea of consent, and then you've got this idea of Miss Valence being very open to sex. Great ideas for discussion, and I think it's stoked up a lot of interest in the community.
Yes, I mean, I mean, she was literally bed hopping, like in the same night, having sex with several women, and I kind of think, how did she not get carpal tunnel syndrome? You know, pleasuring all these different women at once. But, you know, it must have been very exciting. And yeah, that particular one, well, there's a couple of ways of thinking about this, because I've written on heterosexual sex at this time, and the idea of seduction in the early 19th century, it wasn't particularly clear in like heterosexual sex that seduction could involve some kind of coercion, because people at the time really cared more about whether women were seen as respectable or virginal in whatever context that would be, rather than, you know, their own consent was not that important, which is no excuse for Anne Lister whatsoever. And she certainly was, I don't think she was really coercing Miss Valence, although she did take away her key so that Miss Valence couldn't lock the door against her. But there are some more disturbing things later. She certainly wasn't Marquis de Sade, but she read Marquis de Sade. She read Justine, and she, which is very, very, very explicit, sadistic, sexual, philosophical thing, and she read it out loud to some of her lovers, and she talked about like whipping young girls. She did a lot of kind of body talk, which was pretty common at the time, and especially the French, again, were much more explicit about that. And it's really kind of confusing, though, because there's no evidence that she ever hit a woman, or, you know, that was just a fantasy. Nothing like that has ever come, or even fantasized about doing it. She was just like, oh, people do these weird things. But in the trip she had with Sibylla MacLean, I think it's 1828, and Kirsty McHugh and Leigh Mitchinson have discussed this. I think that's one where there's a little more question, because she is, you know, again, they're in bed, because women shared beds all the time. So she's, you know, putting her finger up Sibylla MacLean. And Sibylla MacLean didn't always like it, complained it hurt her. And eventually she seems to like it. Or, you know, Sibylla was older, she was postmenopausal, something like that. So that may have been part of it. But there was some kind of coercion involved, or you know, putting her finger up her, and, you know, it's a kind of gray area. And another thing that's confusing is that her lovers sometimes do say, "Oh, you're hurting me." And Steph Galloway says, well, that may be talking about hurt means being aroused and like feeling ill or discombobulated by being aroused. But sometimes they did say it's more pain than pleasure, like Mary Valence says that. So I think it's just something that we need to explore further.
I think it is. I think it's always very subjective, isn't it? The reading we do around these extracts, and you know, then Anne uses words like, I think it was when that incident with Sibella, Sibella seeming. Oh no, it was Miss Valence actually, where she says seeming or pretending to be asleep. So it's almost you wonder whether there was kind of some implied consent there. It's just very difficult. We come at it from a 21st century perspective. And of course, women, we know, most women then were living in times where they were expected to be passionless. And certainly I think within bed, they would have that kind of like angelic, coquettish, like subdued way of behaving. And Anne Lister was behaving very dominantly. So maybe there was an element of role play going on there as well.
Yeah, and part of the seduction may be just like pretending to be asleep and then pretending this wasn't happening but really getting excited. So it's hard to know, but of course Anne Lister was not a nice person.
I've got to take exception to you there, Anna, because
but she was very manipulative and she lied to people, and you're reading a stream of consciousness. You're reading a diary that spans from 1816 to 1840, and until you have a really enormous grasp of what went on in those 24 years, it's too generalistic a statement to say that she was a nasty person. No, I didn't say she was nasty. I didn't say she's not nasty.
All the time. You know, she. Everybody has their opinion about Anne Lister, but I think everything has to be kept in context. And in 5 million words, it's kind of, I kind of think it's a bit dangerous to put out statements like that, particularly when we're talking about something as sensitive as sex.
Yeah.
And
Unfortunately, we have to move on to our last question. as this is a really great conversation. I think it definitely needs to continue. But we have one last question before we move on to our Q&A. And that is, what were some of Anne's societal limitations, like including like access to medical and historical texts, that might have affected how she understood anatomy and how she understood sex with other women?
I think the best way to describe that is, societal limitations. I mean, health is one massive thing. You know, sex and health are kind of joined together, and we know that she got VD from Mariana Lawton, and Mariana had got it from Charles, her husband. Just the medical limitations and being treated, and the appalling treatments that both Mariana and Anne had and had to live with. That's one of the massive limitations for me when I read the diaries, and how easily would that have been treated today. And there's an amazing passage where I think she goes to see a Dr. Simpson in Manchester, and that she's examined internally by him, and actually she says it hurts when he does it, but that these things really cheaply are not a problem when they have to be done for this kind of reason. But the strange concoction of herbs and things that he prescribed, I just think of those kind of limitations and how that impacted on their lives, physically and emotionally.
I don't know if she was ever treated with mercury, but that would have been the standard treatment for VD, which of course didn't work. But it's unclear whether she had syphilis or gonorrhea. I think it may have been gonorrhea. But she was pretty exceptional in her medical knowledge, as Anne has found, because she was wealthy. She could read Latin, and most of the stuff was written in Latin, and as well as Greek. And So she ordered a lot of these books, and she had more access to the anatomy textbooks than most people did at the time, as well as her own explorations of her own and other women's anatomy. So she was a really brilliant, exceptional person in terms of her energy and her ability to learn, and her enterprise, which I think is conveyed so well in both the book and the show, Gentleman Jack. I mean, when I say she wasn't a nice person, always, maybe I should say that sometimes she wasn't a nice person. Sometimes she did lie to people and manipulate. But I always think of her like, if I had been living then, I would have fallen in love with her and she would have broken my heart. She's that kind of incredibly charismatic, fascinating, amazing person who can be not so nice sometimes. So that's the kind of the way I see her, you know, just incredibly fascinating and attractive. And but she's not a sweet and gentle person, maybe. That's
no, one of the amazing things about Anne Lister is that she is so complex. She's so mercurial. She's so hard to understand. She's full of contradictions, and that's why we like her so much.
Yeah.
I think aren't most people, though. I feel like Anne is just like all of us. We all have multiple layers, and we all have different facades that we put on for different people, including ourselves.
Yeah, and it's those layers of complexity that just make her so fascinating. But just to go back to what you asked, Ty, you know, about limitations and societal limitations. I mean, we just know that the ignorance surrounding women's sexuality at that time that Anne was living, and the marginalisation of women. Ironically, that kind of ignorance and not understanding of women's sexuality proved to be, in some respects, their saviour, because, you know, for Anne Lister, she could operate with women, and they could be with her in the way that they wanted to be, without having a finger of suspicion pointed at them all the time, because society didn't think they could have sex or even possibly even enjoy it. And so that's one of the greatest ironies, that the ignorance about women at that time actually worked in their favour.
Yeah, she wouldn't have been able to be in the parlor in the afternoon with a woman kissing her if she'd been a man. But it's also interesting that she is early 19th century, and there is a change over the century that I mean, she's part of this generational change, is that the ignorance became more prevalent the later we go, especially by the late 19th century. And so in some ways she was still part of this somewhat earlier period where some body language is still being used. The Regency period especially, you know, a lot of nobility had mistresses. There's the divorce trial of being of Queen Caroline, which she's obsessed with, like everyone else in the country. So she is at this kind of changeable time in terms of what she knows and what the popular attitudes were, and also place. So being provincial in Yorkshire, and then London and Paris, and of course the rest of the world, where she's accessing a lot of different cultures.
I guess we can start Q&A if that's all right with you two. Awesome. So if you, for the folks who are watching, you can there's a Q&A box that you can put your questions into, and we have 15 minutes or so I will do my best to get through as many questions as possible. But we're limited in the amount of time that we have today, unfortunately. So the first question is, when writing in the diaries, did Anne's writing and tone change with each woman she was sleeping with? For example, did the way she described her love life with Mariana differ from her love life with Anne Walker?
Absolutely. I mean, we know from those early diary extracts how passionate Anne's sexual relationship was with Mariana, and how packed with coded material those diary pages are. So, you know, when you see those coded pages in those early days, that they're having a lot of sex. And the way she describes the sex as well with Mariana as being delicious. and of the noises Mariana makes when she's having sex with Anne. So if you compare and contrast that to the later diaries where she's having sex with Anne Walker, Anne Lister will use words like, I with Anne Walker, I need to be fastidiously delicate with this woman. And even though Anne and Anne did enjoy good sex, it was certainly not as voluminous in the times that they didn't have as much sex, basically, as Anne and Mariana did. Of course, Anne and Mariana were much younger then, and so yeah, you do see a great difference. And I think it's depending on which woman she was with. You do see changes in the diaries. Maria Barlow, for example. I mean, Maria Barlow was very sexually forward, and that's why I really love Helena's second book, No Priest But Love, because we get to know a lot about women's sexuality in that period when Anne was in France with Mrs. Barlow. And again, you see these diary pages littered with coded extracts of the passion that Mrs. Barlow and Anne Lister enjoyed together.
Yeah, the Mrs. Barlow thing is really interesting because she's very sexually adventurous, but Anne really isn't in love with her, and the way she was with Mariana, or even contemplating having a life with her. And I am thinking that this is a big question that maybe the transcribers can help with it, because there's the big question how much Anne Lister allowed other women to touch her, because she does say, oh, Mariana knew how to handle me, I don't let women touch me. But she's also writing this when she's like, doesn't want a permanent relationship with Maria Barlow, but she keeps on having sex with her and pleasuring her, but not feeling it so much herself. So I just don't know. And I think that's something that we'll be discovering as you all are transcribing, if there's any, because with Anne, as Anne has found, with Anne Walker, there's I love the dinky term. She says at one point, Anne complained I didn't feel the dinky from me. So like implied that she would feel her moisture, her arousal, and getting close enough to touch her, maybe just by thighs or something. But I don't know if there's, and she's getting orgasms from other women, but I just, this is something interesting to think about.
It is, and I think, when you read the diaries and you read the early diaries and you read the later years in the diaries, Anne herself is changing. I mean, she's evolving as a woman. She's not we all evolve, don't we, as we grow older, and her sexual life evolves as well. And we know how complicated the relationship was with Anne Walker, and with Anne Walker's problematic mental health, and how that affected their sex life as well. So again, you see, it's the best contrast is to look at the early diaries with Anne Lister and Mariana Lawton, and all that kind of feverishness of great expectation, of great love from being young, and then the more settling down period of Anne's life in the later diary years with Anne Walker, and a different kind of sex life going on there.
I guess we can move on to our second question. This is a kind of simple one. How many women do we know that Anne had sex with? Is there an actual concrete number, or are we still figuring it out?
I think we have got a kind of number, but I think it's around 11, which is actually it's not a huge number, is it, when you think about it? If you think of Anne Lister's presented in sort of in the mainstream media, and in some research papers, that she was this great libertine, that she was this woman who had lots of lovers. I mean, I've read an article where it said Anne Lister had hundreds of lovers. Well, she would have been delighted if she could have had hundreds of lovers. But I think when you can count on one hand the significant relationships that Anne Lister had, and that meant something to her. And, I think in total where she had a sexual connection with a woman, I think it was around 11, but I'd need to check on that.
All right.
And different degrees of, what constitutes sex or sexual connection. So it could be just a fondle, a kiss, or it could be full sex within those 11.
Yeah. Awesome. The next question, do you think Anne was somewhat intimidated by Miss Pickford because Miss P understood her too well? Do you think that Anne felt safer in her oddity and that it kept people at a distance?
Yeah, I think that's a good insight. I mean, because she certainly would be worried about exposure. I mean, like if people saw them together, um, she'd be more of a category. So that would be a factor there. But it's also interesting that at the time, there was there there was not an image of a lesbian, but the idea of a woman passing as a man, what we would now call trans, but of course they didn't have that word then, that was very common. And in the popular literature, there were a lot of songs about the female sailor, the female soldier, there were a few novels, and mostly there were women supposedly looking for their lovers, but there were autobiographies of people assigned female gender at birth who spent a long time as men, but they don't really talk that much about relationships with other women. So that was an idea that was available to them, and there were probably 100 real cases, like over a 50-year period. There were, there's certainly people who actually did that. So that was something available, but she didn't do that or didn't want to, but she would have lost her money if she had. And then she wouldn't have been able to, female husband, she wouldn't have been able to, be in the parlor with, as we said, with young women.
Awesome, thank you so much. Let me look at, is there any indication that Anne Lister was aware of American women in the feminist movement, like Margaret Fuller and Harriet Hosmer, who was an out lesbian? Is there any indication that she had any understanding or derision or approval of that movement? Or is that?
I mean, I personally haven't come across anything that suggests that, but it could well be. I mean, somebody will tell us if there is that in the diary, with, in her reading. And I mean, we know she read extensively, so she would have been very interested in any kind of feminist movement going on in America. I mean, she always wanted to visit there, and she read a book called Captain Hall's America, and I think she met this chap, and she pulls out extracts from that book, and she talks about the lot of women in America at the time, and about how women are viewed in society in America. And she goes across the various different states and makes comments from what's known about women at that time. So there is something in the diaries about women in America. But I don't know if for me, I don't personally know if she knows of any particular women.
No, they might have been a little bit later, and I don't think she ever went to Rome. She might have met them if she went to Rome, but I don't think she did.
Well, we're winding down for now. We have a lot of questions that we just don't have time to answer. If people want to reach out to you, if they want to stay in contact, what is the best way? Are you on Twitter, Instagram? Like, what's the best way to continue the conversation?
You have. I'm on Twitter. If anybody wants to follow me on Twitter, they're welcome to follow me, and I'll see if I can answer any questions. I can't promise to answer too many, but I'll do my best. And it's really, obviously we could talk all day about Anne Lister and sex. Just sad we've run out of time.
Yeah. And email is the best way to reach me, clark106@umn.edu. I'm very old school and occasionally look at Twitter, but but I'd love to. I do have a blog somewhere, but I never do anything on it. But maybe I'll revive that and try to do more, because I do want to write more about Anne Lister. So I'd love to hear more about what people think. And again, just thank you to all the transcribers who were so fantastic. And I just can't keep up with them.
Can I just finish with an Anne Lister quote?
Yeah.
Seems to sum up everything about what we've been talking about. And in 1816, Anne just says, "The girls liked me and had always liked me." So just kind of sums up the sentence.
So thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you. If people want to continue the conversation on Twitter, you can use the hashtag Anne Lister Summit. There are going to be tons of other things going on throughout the day, so please make sure you check in with those as well. And thank you both so much. It's been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you today.
Thank you,
Thank
Ty.
you
Thank
to
you, Anna.
Steph and Ty and Chantel for making all this, and all the other people who made this possible so quickly, which is totally amazing.
Thank you, everybody.